The year is 1643. England is tearing itself apart. A civil war rages between Crown and Parliament. Churches burn with ideological hatred. God is debated not as faith, but as political weapon. And in a small village called Woolsthorpe, on Christmas Day, a child is born so fragile that no one expects him to survive the night. His name is Isaac Newton. He enters the world prematurely, small enough to fit inside a quart mug. His father is already dead. His mother, Hannah Newton, looks at this weak, silent infant and sees not destiny, but burden. Within 3 years, she will abandon him. This is not the beginning of a hero's journey. This is the beginning of isolation. Newton's earliest memories are not of warmth or safety, but of absence. His mother remarries a wealthy clergyman and leaves Isaac behind to be raised by his grandmother. To a developing mind, this abandonment is not a detail, it is a fracture. From this fracture emerges something dangerous. Newton does not cry loudly. He does not play easily with other children. He watches, he observes, he remembers, and he begins, very early, to build a private world inside his head, one governed by rules, not people. While other children chase each other through fields, Isaac builds mechanical toys, windmills that turn by themselves, paper lanterns that glow like captured stars, water clocks that measure time with obsessive precision. Even as a boy, Newton is not interested in stories, he wants mechanisms. But this curiosity does not make him loved. Classmates find him strange. Teachers find him distracted. When bullied, Newton does not fight back with fists. He retaliates with patience and calculation. One recorded incident tells of a schoolyard rivalry that Newton resolves not by violence, but by intellectual domination, outworking, outperforming, and humiliating his rival academically until superiority is undeniable. This pattern will define his entire life. Newton grows up in a deeply religious England, where God explains everything that science cannot. Yet Newton feels something unsettling, that nature itself is written in a language older than Scripture, a language of numbers, of ratios, of forces. Still, he is not yet a revolutionary. At first, Newton is expected to become a farmer. His family owns land, and practical labor is valued more than abstract thought. But Isaac fails spectacularly at farming. He forgets tasks, loses animals, wanders off mid-work, lost in thought. It is not laziness. It is misalignment. Eventually, his teachers intervene. They recognize something sharp beneath the silence, something obsessive, something dangerous. Newton is sent to grammar school, and later, against all odds, to Cambridge University. But do not mistake this as triumph. Newton does not arrive at Cambridge confident or inspired. He arrives poor, socially invisible, and internally hostile. He studies not to belong, but to conquer. Knowledge becomes not joy, but armor. Like Socrates before him, Newton will question foundations no one dares touch. But unlike Socrates, Newton will not do it publicly. He will do it alone, in darkness, driven not by curiosity, but by an almost pathological need for certainty. The world has already failed him, so he will rebuild it from scratch. This fragile child, born into chaos, abandoned by love, and ignored by society, is about to do something no human has ever done before. He will discover the rules that govern the universe, and once discovered, he will never forgive the world for not seeing his genius soon enough. To understand Isaac Newton, you must first understand the world that shaped his paranoia, his faith, and his obsession with order. 17th century England was not a stable nation. It was a battlefield of ideas, bodies, and beliefs. Kings ruled by divine right until they didn't. Parliament challenged the throne. Neighbours turned against neighbours. The English Civil War ripped the country apart, not only with swords and muskets, but with theology. Every side claimed God. Every side believed history itself was on their side. This was the air Newton breathed. When Newton was a child, England executed its king. Charles I was beheaded in 1649, an act so unthinkable that it shattered the medieval worldview. If a king chosen by God could die like a criminal, then what else could be questioned? Authority cracked. Tradition trembled. And into this vacuum rushed fear. Religious extremism surged. Puritans saw signs of the apocalypse everywhere. Science was not neutral knowledge. It was dangerous territory. To study nature too deeply was to risk heresy. To question scripture was to invite ruin. Yet paradoxically, this chaos created opportunity. As old certainties collapsed, a new hunger emerged. The desire for laws that could not be voted out, executed, or argued away. Laws that were eternal, mathematical, divine. Newton would answer that hunger. But first, the plague. In 1665, the Great Plague returned to England with merciless efficiency. Bodies piled up in the streets of London, universities shut down, Cambridge closed its gates and sent students home, hoping distance might outrun death. Newton returned to Woolsthorpe. Alone. No lectures, no exams, no supervision. For most people, this would have been a lost year. For Newton, it was the most productive period of intellectual creation in human history. But this isolation did not happen in a vacuum. Death surrounded him. Bells tolled endlessly. Entire families vanished overnight. The fragility of human life was not an abstract idea. It was a daily statistic. Newton responded not with despair, but with control. If the world was governed by chaos, he would impose order. If God's will seemed arbitrary, Newton would search for God's equations. Religion, for Newton, was not comfort, it was obsession. He read the Bible with the same intensity he applied to mathematics. He searched for hidden codes, divine timelines, prophetic structures. He believed God had written two books, Scripture and Nature, and Newton intended to decode both. This belief was dangerous. Publicly, England was Anglican. Privately, theological dissent could destroy lives. Newton secretly rejected the doctrine of the Trinity, a belief considered heretical and punishable by exile or worse. He kept these thoughts hidden, written in private notebooks, never intended for publication. Silence became survival. This secrecy shaped his scientific behavior. Newton would delay publishing discoveries for decades. He feared criticism not just as intellectual disagreement, but as existential threat. To be wrong publicly was not merely embarrassing, it was dangerous. Meanwhile, Europe was changing. Galileo had already challenged Aristotle. Descartes proposed a mechanical universe. Kepler revealed that planets did not move in perfect circles. The old worldview was crumbling, but it had not yet been replaced. Newton lived at the fault line between two eras, medieval mysticism and modern science. He did not abandon one for the other, he fused them. To Newton, gravity was not merely force. It was divine intention made visible. This is why Newton never saw himself as destroying religion. He believed he was restoring it, stripping away corrupted interpretations, and revealing the true architecture of God's creation. Yet this conviction came at a cost. In a world where beliefs killed, Newton learned to hide. In a society built on shifting power, Newton learned to trust only proof. And in an age where certainty was collapsing, Newton became obsessed with building something unbreakable. The chaos of England did not distract Newton. It forged him. Out of civil war came his distrust of authority. Out of plague came his isolation. Out of religious terror came his hunger for absolute truth. The universe, Newton would decide, was not governed by opinion. It was governed by law, and soon he would write those laws himself. The year is 1665. Cambridge is silent. Its lecture halls are empty. Its libraries locked. Fear has done what no invading army could. It has shut down the heart of English learning. The plague moves faster than ideas, and survival now means distance. Isaac Newton returns to Woolsthorpe Manor. To the outside world, he is a student sent home. To history, he is a mind about to detonate. Woolsthorpe is quiet. Too quiet. Fields stretch endlessly. Time slows. Days blur together. For most young men, this isolation would rot ambition. For Newton, it removes distraction. No professors to obey, no curriculum to follow, no authority to contradict. For the first time in his life, Newton is alone with reality itself, and he begins asking forbidden questions. What is motion really? Why do objects fall? What governs the paths of planets? What is light? What is time? These are not casual curiosities. They are attacks on the foundation of human knowledge. At the time, Aristotle still rules science. His ideas, refined over nearly 2,000 years, are treated as near sacred truth. Motion requires constant force. The heavens are perfect and separate from Earth. Light is pure and indivisible. Newton suspects all of this is wrong, but suspicion is not enough. He needs proof. Inside his small room at Woolsthorpe, Newton begins working obsessively. He sleeps little, eats irregularly, loses track of days. The outside world fades as his inner universe expands. This is not inspiration. It is compulsion. Newton starts by studying motion. He imagines objects moving not in words, but in numbers. He breaks motion into infinitely small moments, instants something no mathematician has ever done rigorously before. To describe these instants, Newton invents a new mathematics, calculus. He does not name it yet. He does not publish it. He barely tells anyone. But in isolation, Newton creates the mathematical language needed to describe change itself. At the same time, he turns his attention upward. Why does the moon not fall to Earth? Or does it? Newton imagines the moon as perpetually falling, missing the Earth, only because of its sideways motion. The same force that pulls an apple downward might also hold the moon in orbit. This idea is radical. It unites Earth and heavens under one law. For centuries, humans believed the sky obeyed different rules. Newton erases that boundary. Legend will later reduce this moment to an apple falling from a tree. But the truth is darker and more profound. The apple was not revelation. It was confirmation. Newton had already suspected a universal force. The falling apple simply refused to let the question go. Meanwhile, Newton experiments with light. He darkens his room, punctures his shutters, and passes sunlight through glass prisms. What emerges shocks him. White light is not pure. It is composed. Color is not added by glass, it is revealed. This discovery alone would have secured Newton's immortality. But for him, it is just another piece of a larger puzzle. Nature, he realizes, is not qualitative. It is quantitative. Everything motion, light, gravity submits to mathematics. This belief transforms Newton. He no longer sees himself as a student. He sees himself as an architect. Yet this period is not triumphant. Isolation sharpens Newton's brilliance, but it also sharpens his darkness. Without human contact, his mistrust deepens. His secrecy hardens. He writes discoveries in private notebooks, encoded, hidden, as if knowledge itself were dangerous contraband. He fears being wrong. He fears being challenged. He fears being seen. When the plague finally recedes and Cambridge reopens, Newton returns not as a learner, but as someone who has already surpassed his teachers. He carries with him ideas that will rewrite reality, but he will not share them yet, because Isaac Newton does not believe the world is ready, and perhaps more truthfully, he is not ready to face the world. The isolation of Woolsthorpe has done something irreversible. It has shown one man that the universe can be understood, and once seen it cannot be unseen. Isaac Newton did not seek knowledge for wonder. He sought it for control. When he returned to Cambridge after the plague years, he did not return humbled or uncertain. He returned carrying a private certainty so vast it bordered on arrogance, and a fear so deep it bordered on paranoia. Newton had seen the universe obey rules. And once you see rules, disorder becomes intolerable. 17th century science was messy. Contradictory theories coexisted. Scholars argued from authority rather than evidence. Aristotle was cited more than nature itself. To Newton, this was not merely inefficient. It was offensive. Order, he believed, was not a human preference. It was the signature of God. Newton's mind craved systems, structures where nothing was accidental and nothing was vague. Words were unreliable. Diagrams were limited. Mathematics, however, was absolute. Numbers did not argue. They obeyed. At Cambridge, Newton devoured texts not to learn them, but to dismantle them. Descartes, Galileo, Kepler. He read, corrected, extended, and then moved beyond them. What others proposed cautiously, Newton demanded completely. Partial explanations angered him. Approximation felt like failure. This obsession leaked into every aspect of his life. He kept meticulous notebooks, but not orderly ones. Pages were dense, overwritten, revised endlessly. Margins vanished under corrections. Ideas were returned to again and again, not refined for beauty, but for certainty. Newton could not let go. If a proof was not airtight, he would abandon sleep until it was. If a concept felt incomplete, he would tear it apart and rebuild it from first principles. This is how his laws of motion were born, not as elegant statements but as psychological necessities. What does it mean for an object to move? What does it mean for motion to change? What does force truly do? Newton stripped these questions of metaphor. He reduced them to axioms. 3 laws. Simple, relentless. From them, everything else followed. This was not creativity. It was domination. Newton did not want to describe nature. He wanted to bind it. But obsession has a cost. Newton was not easy to live with. He avoided friendships, distrusted praise, interpreted disagreement as attack. When challenged, he did not debate. He retaliated. Quietly, thoroughly. He kept lists of enemies, real and imagined. In private writings, Newton confessed violent thoughts toward rivals and authority figures. He was capable of extreme self-criticism, but even more capable of unforgiving judgment toward others. Order, for Newton, was also moral. He believed the universe reflected God's rational will, and that irrationality was not merely error, but sin. This belief fed his theological studies, his alchemical pursuits, and his refusal to tolerate ambiguity. The world, however, was ambiguous. Human behavior was irrational. Institutions were political, and this frustrated him deeply. Newton responded by retreating further into abstraction. In equations, there were no liars. In proofs, no hypocrisy. In geometry, no betrayal. The cleaner the mathematics, the safer the world felt. Yet this very obsession delayed his impact. Newton sat on discoveries that could have transformed science decades earlier. He revised endlessly, withheld publication, feared imperfection more than obscurity. He was not racing others. He was racing doubt. The irony is cruel. The man who would define order for the universe lived in constant internal tension. The laws he forged were simple, but the mind that forged them was anything but. Order saved Newton, and it imprisoned him, because once you believe the universe must make sense, chaos becomes personal, and Isaac Newton would spend the rest of his life trying to eliminate it. When Isaac Newton arrived at Cambridge, he did not step into a place of innovation. He stepped into a museum. The university still lived under the long shadow of Aristotle, a philosopher dead for nearly 2,000 years, yet treated as unquestionable authority. His writings defined motion, matter, and the structure of the cosmos. To disagree was not intellectual courage. It was rebellion. Students were taught what to think, not how to test. Arguments were settled by citation, not experiment. Nature itself was secondary to tradition. Newton hated this, not openly, not yet. Outwardly he complied, inwardly he dismantled. He attended lectures while privately annotating their errors. He copied Aristotle's claims only to surround them with corrections, counterexamples, and mathematical objections. What others memorized, Newton interrogated. Why must motion require constant force? Why must the heavens be perfect? Why must earth obey different laws than the sky? Aristotle offered answers. Newton demanded proof. Cambridge at this time was slowly changing. New ideas crept in through banned books and whispered discussions. Galileo's experiments, Descartes' mechanical philosophy, Kepler's planetary laws. These thinkers challenged Aristotle, but none had replaced him completely. Newton saw the gap, and he intended to fill it. Unlike his peers, Newton did not align himself with any one school of thought. He borrowed ruthlessly. From Descartes, he took geometry. From Galileo, experimentation. From Kepler, astronomical precision. Then he went further. Where Descartes speculated, Newton calculated. Where Galileo described motion, Newton defined it. Where Aristotle asserted, Newton proved. This was not evolution. It was overthrow. Yet Newton worked in silence. He understood the danger of open confrontation. Academic politics were brutal. To attack Aristotle publicly was to challenge the legitimacy of the institution itself. Newton chose a different strategy. He would not argue. He would replace. He began teaching as a young professor, lecturing on optics and mathematics. Students struggled to follow him. His ideas were too advanced, his delivery too cold, his logic too compressed. But Newton did not care. He was not there to persuade minds. He was there to build a system so complete that persuasion would become irrelevant. Aristotle's universe was qualitative. Newton's would be quantitative. Aristotle explained why things happened. Newton would show how with equations that left no room for opinion. Slowly, the old framework began to crack. Experiments contradicted tradition. Measurements embarrassed philosophy. Mathematics exposed assumptions. By the time Newton's ideas would fully emerge, Aristotle would not be debated. He would be obsolete. But during these Cambridge years, Newton carried the weight of opposition alone. No mentor guided him. No institution protected him. He was isolated even in the center of learning. This isolation sharpened his resolve. If the world clung to the past, Newton would drag it into the future not with rhetoric, but with inevitability. The shadow of Aristotle loomed large. Isaac Newton prepared to erase it. Genius rarely announces itself. It leaks, in fragments, in private notes, in half-finished ideas that frighten even the mind that creates them. By the late 1660s, Isaac Newton had not yet published anything that would shake the world. To Cambridge, he was a quiet, difficult scholar. To colleagues, an intense but unremarkable mathematician. But beneath this modest surface, something unprecedented was forming. Newton's notebooks from this period read less like academic records and more like a battlefield. Ideas collide. Symbols are crossed out, rewritten, redefined. Diagrams evolve across pages. There is no polish, only pursuit. This is where genius truly lives. Not in applause, but in struggle. Newton begins extending mathematics beyond its known limits. Geometry, long constrained to static shapes, is forced to describe motion. Quantities no longer merely are they change. To capture this, Newton introduces fluxions quantities in flow. Time becomes implicit. Change becomes calculable. This is revolutionary. Yet Newton treats it as provisional. He does not celebrate discovery. He distrusts it. Every insight is tested, retested, attacked from multiple angles. Newton assumes he is wrong until proven otherwise, and even then he hesitates. At the same time, his work in optics accelerates. He constructs improved telescopes, grinding mirrors with obsessive precision. These instruments are not built for admiration. They are weapons against uncertainty. With them, Newton demonstrates that chromatic aberration is unavoidable in refracting telescopes, a fact no one else had understood. His reflecting telescope, smaller yet more powerful, earns him sudden attention. For the first time, the world notices. The Royal Society, England's leading scientific institution, takes interest. Newton is invited to present his findings on light and colour. This should be triumph. It becomes trauma. Criticism follows. Questions are raised. Robert Hooke, already famous and deeply insecure, challenges Newton's conclusions. What should have been routine scholarly debate feels, to Newton, like an attack. He recoils. The glimpse of recognition is enough to confirm his brilliance, and enough to convince him that exposure is dangerous. Newton retreats. He publishes little, corresponds selectively, shares only what he must. The world is not ready, he decides, and neither is he. But something has shifted. Newton now knows that his private thoughts are not eccentricities. They are discoveries. The universe is yielding to him. Slowly, reluctantly, yet unmistakably. These early years do not produce a masterpiece. They produce a mindset. Newton learns that truth is lonely, that genius attracts enemies, that certainty invites resistance. He also learns something far more dangerous, that he might be right. And once that possibility takes root, there is no turning back. The foundations are laid. The laws are waiting. The world just doesn't know it yet. History loves simple stories. A single apple, a sudden realization, a genius struck by inspiration beneath a tree. It is clean, memorable, and mostly wrong. The apple did fall. Newton himself confirmed that much later in life. But the myth hides the truth, and the truth is far more unsettling. The apple did not create an idea. It refused to let one die. By the time the famous apple dropped at Woolsthorpe, Isaac Newton was already obsessed with gravity, though he did not yet call it that. He was wrestling with a deeper question: why motion obeys patterns at all? Objects fall, planets move, The moon circles Earth. Everyone could see these things. No one could explain them with certainty. Aristotle claimed objects fell because they sought their natural place. Descartes imagined invisible vortices pushing planets through space. These explanations sounded sophisticated, but they collapsed under scrutiny. They described behavior without explaining cause. Newton wanted more. He wanted inevitability. When the apple fell, it did not whisper secrets. It issued a challenge. Why straight down? Why not sideways? Why not upward? Why always toward the center of Earth? And then the more dangerous question followed. If the Earth pulls the apple, why doesn't it pull the moon? Or does it? This thought was not poetic. It was terrifying, because if the same force governed both apple and moon, then the universe was unified in a way no human had ever proven. Earth and heavens, once believed separate, would be bound by a single rule. Newton began calculating, not guessing, not speculating, calculating. He compared the rate at which objects fall on Earth to the rate at which the moon curves away from straight-line motion. He used geometry, ratios, and his private mathematical tools to test the idea. At first, the numbers didn't work. This is where the myth usually ends, and where real genius begins. Newton did not force the answer. He assumed he was wrong. He rechecked measurements, revised distances, reworked assumptions about Earth's size. Years later, with better data, the calculation finally aligned. The moon was falling, endlessly, perpetually missing Earth due to its sideways velocity. Gravity was not a downward force. It was a universal attraction. This realization was not joyful. It was destabilizing, because gravity acted at a distance. No visible connection, no physical contact, no mechanical explanation. How could Earth influence the moon across empty space? This bothered Newton deeply. He distrusted ideas he could not justify mechanistically. Yet the mathematics refused to lie. Gravity worked, whether he liked it or not. So Newton did what he always did when reality conflicted with comfort. He chose reality, but he did not rush to tell the world. The idea was too powerful, too vulnerable, too easy to misunderstand or attack. Critics would accuse him of invoking magic action. At a distance sounded dangerously close to superstition. Newton retreated again into silence. For years, gravity remained mostly private, a concept refined in notebooks, revisited obsessively, polished into something unassailable. The apple story survived because it was harmless. The truth was revolutionary. Gravity did not explain why the universe existed. It explained how it behaved, predictably, precisely, without intention. And this had consequences far beyond falling fruit. If gravity could be calculated, then the future could be predicted. Planetary motion, tides, orbits, eclipses. The cosmos became a machine not ruled by whims, but by laws. This was not merely a scientific breakthrough. It was a philosophical earthquake. Humanity was no longer at the center of a mysterious, purpose-driven cosmos. It was inside a system, obedient to equations. And Isaac Newton was the first man to write those equations down. The apple did not make him a genius. It exposed one. And once gravity entered human understanding, the universe would never again feel unknowable, only brutally precise. Great revolutions are usually loud. They announce themselves with manifestos, debates, and public defiance. This one happened in near total silence. While Europe argued over philosophy and theology, Isaac Newton was inventing a new language not to persuade, but to understand change itself. The problem was simple to describe, and impossible to solve with existing tools. How do you measure something that is constantly changing? Geometry could describe shapes frozen in time. Arithmetic could count fixed quantities. But motion, real motion, slipped through their fingers. Velocity changed every instant. Acceleration changed velocity, and time never stopped long enough to be measured. To most scholars, this was a limitation of the human mind. To Newton, it was a challenge. During his isolated years, Newton began imagining quantities not as static values, but as flowing entities. Lines growing, areas accumulating, speeds increasing and decreasing from moment to moment. He called these changing quantities fluxions. Time was the hidden variable. Everything flowed through it. To calculate motion, Newton did something radical. He broke time itself into infinitely small pieces. Not zero, not nothing, but smaller than anything measurable. Instant. At this scale, change became manageable. Slopes could be calculated, rates could be compared, motion could be captured mid-flight. This was calculus. Though Newton did not call it that, he treated it like a dangerous secret. Why? Because calculus undermined the foundations of classical mathematics. It relied on infinitesimals, quantities so small they bordered on the philosophical. Critics would accuse it of being illogical, even heretical, and Newton, already sensitive to attack, refused to expose his ideas before they were invincible. So he worked alone. He developed rules for differentiation measuring how fast something changes at an instant. He developed integration reconstructing whole quantities from infinitely small parts. With this new mathematics, the universe became writable. Planetary motion was no longer descriptive, it was predictable. Forces could be linked to acceleration. Curves could be analyzed with precision. Nature began to speak fluently in numbers. But Newton still said nothing. Years passed. Meanwhile, in Germany, another brilliant mind, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, independently developed his own version of calculus. He published first. His notation was clearer. His influence spread quickly across Europe. When Newton finally emerged, controversy erupted. Who invented calculus? The question poisoned lives and reputations. Newton, now powerful, accused Leibniz of plagiarism. Leibniz denied it fiercely. The scientific world split along national lines. The tragedy is that both were right. But Newton's silence had consequences. His secrecy, born of fear, delayed progress. His obsession with priority, born of insecurity, hardened into bitterness. Yet the mathematics itself endured. Calculus became the backbone of modern science. Physics, engineering, economics, biology, spaceflight. Every equation describing change traces back to that silent period when one man refused to accept that motion was beyond understanding. Newton did not invent calculus to be famous. He invented it because the universe demanded it. And once invented, it could not be unmade. The world now had a tool to describe reality as it actually behaves, not in snapshots, but in flow. Change had been conquered. And Isaac Newton had done it alone, in the quiet, driven not by ambition, but by necessity. Before Isaac Newton, motion was a mystery wrapped in tradition. Objects moved because they were pushed, stopped because they were tired, fell because they belonged somewhere else. These explanations were inherited, repeated, and rarely questioned. Newton questioned all of them. He did not ask why motion exists. He asked what rules it obeys. Using his newly forged mathematics, Newton stripped motion down to its essentials. He imagined a universe empty of friction, superstition, and purpose, a universe where objects did only what forces compelled them to do. What remained was startlingly simple. An object at rest stays at rest. An object in motion stays in motion, unless acted upon. This was not obvious in everyday life. Friction hides the truth. Air resists. Surfaces slow things down. But in the vacuum of thought, Newton revealed something radical. Rest and motion were the same state. Only force caused change. This became his first law. Then came the deeper insight. Force does not cause motion. Force causes change in motion. Acceleration. This distinction reshaped reality. Newton expressed it mathematically. Force is proportional to the rate of change of momentum. Not speed, not position. Change itself. This was his second law, the engine of classical physics. Finally, symmetry. For every action, an equal and opposite reaction. The universe, Newton realized, was balanced. Push the world, and it pushes back. Nothing acts alone. Every force exists in a pair. This was his third law. Together, these three statements did something extraordinary. They transformed the universe into a machine, not a living organism, not a moral system, not a theatre of divine moods. A mechanism. Given initial conditions, the future could be calculated. Planets followed predictable paths. Projectiles traced precise arcs. Tides obeyed lunar gravity. Nature became deterministic. This terrified some. If the universe was a machine, where was free will? Where was divine intervention? Where was meaning? Newton did not concern himself with these questions publicly. Privately, they haunted him. He did not believe he had removed God. He believed he had revealed God's design. The universe was a clock. God was the clockmaker, and Newton had deciphered the gears. With motion and force united, physics was no longer descriptive. It was predictive. This was power unlike anything humanity had ever possessed. Yet Newton still hesitated to publish. The implications were enormous. The resistance would be fierce. To challenge centuries of belief required not just truth, but authority. That authority would soon arrive. And when it did, Newton would unleash his vision of a clockwork universe upon the world, forever changing how humanity understood reality. In 1684, a visitor arrived at Isaac Newton's rooms in Cambridge. His name was Edmund Halley. He asked a simple question with explosive consequences. What path would a planet follow if it were attracted to the sun by a force that decreased with distance? Newton answered without hesitation. An ellipse, not a guess, not a hypothesis, a calculation. Halley was stunned. What Newton casually revealed was something the scientific world had failed to prove for decades. Kepler had described planetary motion, but no one had explained why it worked. Newton already had the answer. Written, proven, hidden. Halley immediately understood the magnitude of what Newton possessed. He begged him to publish. Newton resisted. He always did. Publication meant exposure. Exposure meant attack. But this time, retreat was impossible. Halley pressed harder. What followed was one of the most intense intellectual efforts in human history. Newton began writing Philosophia Naturalis, Principia Mathematica, the Principia. It was not a book. It was a weapon. Page by page, Newton dismantled the old universe and replaced it with a new one. Using geometry so dense that only a handful of people could follow it, he derived the laws of motion, universal gravitation, and celestial mechanics from first principles. No metaphors, no speculation, no appeal to authority. Only proof. The Principia unified heaven and earth. The same force that dropped an apple governed the motion of planets. The same laws ruled stones, tides, comets, and stars. For the first time, the universe was mathematically coherent. This terrified people, because the Principia implied something radical. Nature did not need constant divine intervention. Once set in motion, the universe ran on its own laws. God had designed it, but he no longer micromanaged it. This idea was explosive. If accepted, it would redefine theology, philosophy, and humanity's place in existence. Newton was aware of the danger. That is why the book was so unforgiving. Every argument was airtight, every conclusion unavoidable. Critics were not debated, they were crushed in advance. Even so, Newton nearly abandoned the project multiple times. Old rivalries resurfaced. Robert Hooke claimed prior insight into gravity. Newton, enraged, threatened to withdraw the entire work. Halley intervened again, calming, encouraging, financing the publication himself when the Royal Society ran out of money. Without Halley, the Principia would not exist. When it was finally published in 1687, few could read it, but those who could understood immediately. This book did not merely explain the universe. It replaced it. Aristotle fell. Descartes collapsed. Speculation died. From this moment on, science would demand mathematics, and Isaac Newton became its ruler. The Principia was dangerous not because it was wrong, but because it was right, and once humanity accepted that the universe obeyed laws, not opinions, there was no going back. The Principia did more than explain motion. It quietly redefined reality itself. Before Newton, time and space were background assumptions, vague, flexible, and deeply philosophical. Time flowed because God willed it. Space existed as a container for creation. Few questioned their nature, because nothing precise depended on them. Newton changed that. To make his laws work universally, Newton needed something radical: absolute time and absolute space. Time, he argued, flows uniformly, the same everywhere, unaffected by motion, matter, or perception. Space exists independently, an unchanging stage upon which the universe performs. This was not poetic. It was functional. Without absolute time, velocity could not be defined consistently. Without absolute space, motion had no fixed reference. The equations collapsed without these assumptions. So Newton declared them real. This decision was controversial. Philosophers objected. How could time exist without events? How could space exist without objects? Was Newton smuggling metaphysics into physics? Newton did not apologize. He was not describing what humans experienced. He was describing what equations required. Time became something that could be measured, sliced, compared. Seconds, minutes, hours, identical everywhere in the cosmos. Space became a coordinate system: positions, distances, trajectories. Reality became measurable. This transformation had enormous consequences. Navigation improved. Astronomy advanced. Engineering evolved. The world could now be mapped, predicted, controlled. Yet Newton himself was uneasy. Absolute space and time felt dangerously close to divine attributes. Eternal, infinite, unchanging. Privately, Newton associated them with God's presence, a sensorium through which the divine perceived creation. He would never say this openly, but it haunted him. Was he revealing the structure of the universe, or trespassing into God's domain? For over 2 centuries, Newton's framework dominated all of science. Space and time were treated as unquestionable. Physics operated within them like a perfect machine, until one day, a young patent clerk would notice a crack. Einstein would later show that time bends and space curves, that Newton's absolutes were approximations. But that does not diminish Newton, because before relativity, before modern physics, there had to be structure. And Newton provided it. He gave humanity a stable universe, one that could be understood, calculated, and trusted. Time became a ruler. Space became a grid. Reality became predictable. This was not the final truth, but it was the first usable one. And for generations, it worked. Perfectly. Isaac Newton achieved what few humans ever do. He became undeniable. After the Principia, resistance collapsed. Debate faded. Opposition quieted. The universe itself seemed to side with him. Predictions worked. Calculations matched observation. Comets returned exactly when Newtonian physics said they would. Truth had chosen a champion. And yet, Newton found no peace in victory. Fame arrived late in his life, and it arrived distorted. He was admired, feared, and revered, but rarely understood. His work was praised more than he was loved. His ideas spread faster than his friendships ever had. Newton did not enjoy admiration. He distrusted it. Praise felt temporary. Applause felt shallow. Behind every compliment he sensed envy. Behind every question, an attack. The same mind that had conquered the universe could not rest inside itself. Recognition pulled him out of isolation, and he hated it. Invitations flooded in. Scholars wrote letters seeking approval. Young scientists treated him like a living authority. Newton responded selectively, coldly, often dismissively. He had waited decades to be heard, and now that the world listened, he withdrew again. Power changed his posture. He no longer needed to prove himself. He needed to defend his position. Newton became hyper-protective of his legacy. Priority mattered, credit mattered, being first mattered. Not for vanity, but for survival. In Newton's mind, to lose ownership of an idea was to lose control of reality itself. This paranoia hardened him. Disagreements escalated into vendettas. Minor criticisms became lifelong grudges. Newton did not forget slights. He archived them, catalogued them, replayed them internally for years. Fame amplified what isolation had already shaped. He was now alone at the top, and the summit was cold. Despite his dominance in science, Newton struggled with human connection. He never married, never formed deep romantic bonds. His closest relationships were intellectual, and even those were fragile. The public saw a genius. They did not see the cost. Sleep eluded him. His health deteriorated. Periods of intense productivity alternated with exhaustion and emotional withdrawal. Modern historians would recognize signs of severe anxiety, possibly depression, possibly something deeper. But Newton would never admit weakness. Control was everything. In public, he projected certainty. In private, he questioned relentlessly. Had he gone too far? Had he revealed too much? Had he misunderstood God's intentions? Fame did not answer these questions. It magnified them. Newton had given humanity laws, but he could not give himself rest. The universe now made sense, but his place in it did not. And so the man who explained motion remained internally motionless, trapped between triumph and unease, certainty and fear. Fame had crowned him, but it had not healed him. Isaac Newton did not merely discover truths. He defended them like territory. To Newton, ideas were not shared possessions. They were hard-won victories wrestled from nature itself. And anyone who challenged them even honestly was not a colleague. They were a threat. The scientific world of the 17th century was small, competitive, and brutally personal. Reputation was currency. Priority was power. To be second was to be forgotten. Newton understood this better than anyone, and nowhere did this become clearer than in his conflicts. The most infamous was with Robert Hooke. Hooke was brilliant, imaginative, and widely respected. He was also insecure, combative, and desperate for recognition. Where Newton was silent and precise, Hooke was vocal and speculative. Their temperaments were incompatible. When Newton presented his early work on optics, Hooke criticized it publicly, not maliciously, but openly. To Newton, this was unforgivable. He interpreted Hooke's objections not as scientific debate, but as personal assault. The response was swift and extreme. Newton withdrew from public scientific discourse for years. Silence became his weapon, but the resentment never faded. When gravity entered the conversation, Hooke claimed he had anticipated the inverse square law. Newton dismissed him entirely. In private letters, his contempt was unmistakable. He erased Hooke's contributions whenever possible. History would remember Newton. Hooke would fade. Then came the war with Leibniz. Calculus, the language Newton had invented in secrecy, was now public, but under another man's name. Leibniz had published first. His notation spread rapidly. Europe credited him as the inventor. Newton felt robbed. What followed was not a debate. It was an execution. Using his authority within the Royal Society, Newton orchestrated an investigation into the origin of calculus. He wrote anonymous reports praising himself. He influenced conclusions. He shaped the narrative. The verdict declared Newton the true inventor. Leibniz was disgraced. The scientific community fractured along national lines. Progress slowed. Collaboration died. Mathematics stagnated in Britain for decades because Newton's notation, inferior but politically enforced, was defended out of loyalty rather than utility. This was not science at its best. It was power, and Newton wielded it mercilessly. Yet these conflicts reveal something deeper. Newton did not fear being wrong. He feared being replaced. His identity was fused with his discoveries. To challenge his work was to challenge his existence. To share credit was to dilute certainty. So he fought, quietly, strategically, relentlessly. This is the paradox of Newton. The man who revealed universal laws could not tolerate uncertainty in human affairs. The architect of rational science was emotionally irrational, and yet without this ferocity, would his work have survived? In a hostile intellectual climate, perhaps only obsession could protect truth. Newton paid the price in isolation, bitterness, and controversy, but history sided with him. His enemies faded. His equations remained. The wars were ugly. The legacy was eternal. Light had always seemed simple. It illuminated. It revealed. It obeyed the Sunday. For centuries, scholars believed light was pure, a single, indivisible substance that merely changed when it passed through glass or water. Colour, they thought, was added by distortion or impurity. Isaac Newton suspected otherwise, and suspicion, for him, was enough to begin war. In a darkened room at Cambridge, Newton sealed the windows and pierced the shutters with a single small hole. A thin beam of sunlight entered the room and struck a glass prism. The light exploded into colour. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. This alone was not new. What Newton did next was, he passed the coloured light through a second prism. If colour were created by glass, it should change again. It didn't. Red stayed red. Blue stayed blue. Colour was not added. It was revealed. White light, Newton realised, was not pure. It was composite. This discovery shattered centuries of belief. Light was no longer a divine simplicity. It was a structured phenomenon, obeying rules, separable, measurable. Newton pushed further. He measured angles. refraction rates, wavelength behavior long before the word wavelength existed. He showed that different colors bent differently because they were inherently different. Nature had structure where philosophy assumed unity. This was not a minor correction. It was a conceptual revolution. Light, once symbolic of divine truth, became an object of analysis, and that made people uncomfortable. When Newton published his findings, resistance was immediate. Critics accused him of overreach. Some claimed his experiments were flawed. Others rejected the implications outright. Once again, Robert Hooke objected. Once again, Newton retreated. But this time, he did not doubt his result. He doubted humanity's readiness. Light had become another domain where Newton imposed order, where mystery gave way to measurement. Yet this victory carried irony. Newton believed light was composed of particles, corpuscles, not waves. In this, he was wrong. Centuries later, wave theory and eventually quantum mechanics would correct him. But that does not erase his achievement, because Newton proved something far more important than the nature of light. He proved how truth must be discovered, not by authority, not by tradition, not by argument, but by experiment, by isolating variables, by testing assumptions, by forcing nature to answer precise questions. Light broke apart under Newton's gaze, and with it, the old way of understanding the world fractured. From now on, even the most familiar phenomena would be interrogated. Nothing would be taken at face value, not even light itself. Some rivalries are fueled by ideas. This one was fueled by ego, insecurity, and memory. Robert Hooke was everything Isaac Newton despised in public science. Loud, speculative, constantly visible. He published quickly, spoke confidently, and guarded his reputation with ferocity. He thrived in debate. Newton did not. Where Hooke lived in conversation, Newton lived in silence. Where Hooke proposed, Newton proved. And where Hooke sought recognition, Newton sought certainty. Their conflict was inevitable. It began with optics. When Newton presented his theory of light to the Royal Society, Hooke criticized it not viciously, but assertively. He questioned Newton's conclusions and offered alternative interpretations. In modern science, this would be routine. To Newton, it was betrayal. He had exposed his work. He had taken a risk. And Hooke had challenged it publicly. Newton never forgot this. Years later, when gravity entered the discussion, the rivalry reignited. Hooke claimed he had long suspected an inverse square attraction governing planetary motion. He suggested that Newton had merely formalized ideas already in circulation. Newton was furious. Suspicion was not proof. Guesswork was not discovery. Hooke had offered intuition. Newton had delivered mathematics. But Newton also feared something deeper, that history might blur the difference. So he erased Hooke wherever possible. In private letters, Newton dismissed Hooke's contributions entirely. In public, he minimized them. When the Principia was written, Hooke's name was nearly absent. After Hooke's death, Newton's influence only grew. As president of the Royal Society, he oversaw its records. Hooke's portrait disappeared. His legacy dimmed. Whether this was intentional or incidental remains debated, but the outcome is clear. History remembers Newton. Hooke became a footnote. This war was not about light or gravity. It was about control of narrative. Newton believed truth must be protected, even from those who glimpsed it imperfectly. He could not tolerate approximation sharing space with precision, and so he fought, not with insults, with silence, omission, and authority. It worked, but the cost was human. Hooke died embittered. Newton lived isolated. Science advanced, but collaboration suffered. This conflict exposes Newton's darkest trait. He was not content to be right. He needed to be uncontested. And in achieving that, he shaped not only physics, but the culture of science itself. To the modern mind, Isaac Newton is reason incarnate. Equations, laws, precision. But this image is incomplete, because in the shadows of his scientific triumphs, Newton pursued something far older and far more dangerous: alchemy. For decades, Newton devoted enormous time and energy to texts that most scholars dismissed as superstition. Ancient manuscripts, cryptic symbols, coded recipes. the search for the philosopher's stone, the transmutation of metals, the hidden structure of matter. This was not a hobby. It was obsession. Newton wrote more on alchemy than on physics. He conducted secret experiments late into the night, inhaling toxic fumes, risking his health, documenting results in encrypted language meant to keep outsiders away. Why? Because alchemy promised something science did not yet offer: unity. Alchemists believed matter was governed by deep, hidden principles, that beneath diversity lay structure, transformation, law. This appealed directly to Newton's mind. Alchemy was not magic to him. It was incomplete science, a domain waiting to be purified by reason. But alchemy was dangerous socially, as well as physically. It was associated with heresy, fraud, and occultism. To admit interest could destroy a reputation. Newton hid his alchemical work carefully, sharing it with no one. Publicly, he was the architect of rational science. Privately, he was chasing secrets whispered across centuries. This duality reveals something essential. Newton did not divide the world into science and superstition. He divided it into understood and not yet understood. Alchemy belonged to the latter. He believed God had encoded truths in nature, and that human arrogance, not divine mystery, prevented their discovery. The universe was not meant to be vague, it was meant to be decoded, even matter itself. Some historians believe Newton's alchemical experiments contributed to his mental and physical breakdowns. Mercury poisoning was common. Sleeplessness intensified. Paranoia deepened. Yet he never abandoned the work, because alchemy spoke to his deepest belief, that nothing in nature is arbitrary. Everything transforms according to law. Even lead, even gold, even the human soul. Newton never succeeded in alchemy, but alchemy shaped him. It taught him patience, secrecy, symbolic thinking. It reinforced his belief that the universe had layers, visible laws resting atop hidden structures. And in this, alchemy did not oppose science. It prepared it. The rational universe Newton revealed did not emerge from pure logic alone. It emerged from a mind willing to stare into the unknown, even when the unknown looked irrational. Isaac Newton did not believe science replaced God. He believed it revealed him. This is where modern interpretations often fail. They imagine Newton as a cold rationalist, stripping the universe of meaning and leaving only machinery behind. But Newton himself would have rejected this fiercely. For him, the equations were not the end. They were evidence. Newton's God was not distant or symbolic. He was real, intentional, and omnipresent. The universe, in Newton's view, was not self-explanatory. Laws described how things moved, not why they existed at all. That why belonged to God. Gravity did not diminish divine power. It magnified it. A universe that could operate through simple, universal laws was, to Newton, far more impressive than one that required constant supernatural correction. God was the architect. The laws were his design, but Newton's theology was dangerous. Privately, he rejected the Trinity, one of Christianity's core doctrines. He believed it was a corruption introduced centuries after Christ. This belief, if exposed, could have ended his career and possibly his life. So he hid it, just as he hid his alchemy, just as he delayed his science. Secrecy was survival. Newton studied scripture with the same intensity he applied to physics. He analyzed prophetic timelines, compared translations, calculated dates. He believed the Bible contained encoded truths, accessible only through rigorous analysis. Faith, like nature, had structure, and chaos, whether theological or physical, offended him. Newton saw himself not as a destroyer of religion, but as its purifier. He believed false doctrines obscured God's true nature, just as flawed theories obscured nature's laws. This conviction isolated him. He trusted almost no one with his beliefs. Public conformity masked private heresy. Even his closest colleagues never fully knew his faith. And yet, God remained central. Newton famously said he felt like a child playing on the seashore, while the great ocean of truth lay undiscovered before him. This was not humility for show. It was genuine awe. Despite everything he had uncovered, Newton believed he had barely begun. The equations worked. The universe obeyed. But behind every law stood intention. Order did not arise by accident. And Isaac Newton, more than any scientist before him, believed his work was not an act of rebellion against God, but an act of devotion. Isaac Newton lived a double life. Publicly, he was the face of rational order, the man who revealed God's laws written into nature. Privately, he held beliefs that could have destroyed him if exposed. Newton was a heretic, not loudly, not defiantly, but precisely. He rejected the Trinity, the foundational doctrine of mainstream Christianity. To Newton, the idea that God could be simultaneously three in one violated reason and corrupted Scripture. He believed early Christianity had been altered, that power, not truth, shaped doctrine. This was not a casual opinion. It was treasonous. In 17th century England, denying the Trinity could cost you your position, your freedom, or your life. University fellows were required to affirm orthodox belief. Newton did so publicly while privately rejecting it completely. His notebooks tell the real story. Pages of theological analysis, scriptural comparisons, ancient sources examined with forensic intensity. Newton did not speculate, he prosecuted doctrine as if it were on trial. He believed truth had been buried, and he intended to exhume it. Why take this risk? Because for Newton, contradiction was intolerable. A God who governed a rational universe could not demand irrational belief. Faith had to be consistent with reason, or it was false. This conviction isolated him further. He trusted no one with his theology. Even when promoted, even when powerful, he remained silent. His secrecy was not cowardice. It was calculation. The same mind that protected scientific discoveries protected theological dissent. Newton's God was singular, absolute, and sovereign, not mystical, not fragmented. And this view aligned with his vision of the universe unified, ordered, governed by law. Heresy did not weaken his faith. It sharpened it, but living in contradiction takes a toll. The pressure of concealment fed his paranoia. Every conversation became risky, every document dangerous. He encoded notes, hid manuscripts, and avoided intimacy. Truth, for Newton, was sacred, and therefore solitary. The irony is profound. The man who revealed universal laws to humanity could not reveal his deepest beliefs to anyone. He expanded human understanding while shrinking his own circle of trust to nearly nothing. Heresy lived in the shadows, and Isaac Newton lived with it every day. Even the strongest structures crack under pressure. By the early 1690s, Isaac Newton began to unravel. The signs were subtle at first. Sleeplessness, irritability, withdrawal. Then came something darker. Paranoia sharpened. Letters grew erratic. Friends were accused of betrayal. Allies became enemies overnight. Newton, the man who had imposed order on the universe, was losing control of his own mind. In 1693, he suffered what modern historians believe was a severe nervous breakdown. He stopped sleeping for days at a time. He became convinced that others were conspiring against him. He wrote frantic letters claiming longtime friends were trying to destroy him. One letter accused a close associate of having endeavored to embroil me with women. Another suggested elaborate plots with no evidence. This was not calculation. This was collapse. Several causes likely converged. Years of isolation, unrelenting obsession, the psychological toll of secrecy, and possibly mercury poisoning from decades of alchemical experiments. Newton had pushed himself beyond human limits, and the mind rebelled. For months, his work ceased. His reputation trembled. Those around him worried he might never recover. In another era, another man, this would have ended everything. But Newton survived. Slowly, painfully, he stabilized. The paranoia receded. Sleep returned. His correspondence regained coherence. Whether through sheer resilience or disciplined self-control, he rebuilt himself. Yet he was changed. The intensity softened, but the suspicion remained. He emerged less creative, but more administrative. Less exploratory, but more controlling. The breakdown marked a turning point. The era of solitary discovery was ending. The era of authority was beginning. Newton had bent his mind to understand the universe. The universe had bent back. And for the first time, Isaac Newton learned that even genius has limits. Genius is often imagined as a gift. For Isaac Newton, it was a burden. By the time he recovered from his breakdown, the fire that once consumed him burned differently. The obsessive creation slowed. The revolutionary insights were mostly behind him. What remained was something colder control. Newton had given everything to understanding the universe, and the cost was nearly everything else. He had no family of his own, no lifelong friendships untouched by suspicion, no refuge from his own mind. His brilliance had isolated him not only from society, but from ordinary human comfort. Even joy felt inefficient. Newton's relationships were transactional. Respect replaced intimacy. Authority replaced trust. He was admired, but rarely approached with warmth, and he preferred it that way. Solitude felt safer, yet this solitude came with consequence. Without distraction, Newton lived constantly with his thoughts replaying old slights, re-examining old arguments, relitigating intellectual wars long after they were over. Victory did not bring closure. It brought vigilance. He guarded his legacy as fiercely as he had guarded his ideas. Every publication, every credit, every mention mattered. History, to Newton, was another system that had to be controlled, because chaos could return anywhere, even in memory. The irony is painful. The man who revealed simplicity behind complexity lived a life of emotional complexity without resolution. The laws he discovered were elegant and clear. His inner world was neither. Yet without this severity, without this relentless self-sacrifice, the work might never have existed. Newton did not balance life and discovery. He chose discovery, completely. And through that choice, he reshaped humanity's understanding of reality, while narrowing his own experience of it. Absolute genius demands absolute payment. Newton paid it, in full. When Isaac Newton accepted the position of Warden of the Royal Mint in 1696, many believed it was a ceremonial reward for a lifetime of intellectual service. They were wrong. Newton did not accept positions to be honoured. He accepted them to impose order. England's economy was collapsing under a quiet crisis. Silver coins were being clipped, shaved at the edges, melted down, and resold for profit. Counterfeiters flooded the market. Trust in currency eroded. Trade suffered. The state bled from 1,000 small crimes. To most administrators, this was a financial problem. To Newton, it was a violation of law, and violations demanded correction. Unlike his predecessors, Newton did not delegate. He moved to London. He studied minting processes personally. He learned metallurgy, logistics, accounting, mastering the system as thoroughly as he had mastered mechanics. Then he did something extraordinary. He turned detective. Newton compiled evidence. He interviewed informants. He interrogated suspects himself, sometimes for hours, sometimes repeatedly, patiently dismantling their stories with the same relentless logic he applied to equations. This was not theoretical justice. This was applied force. He tracked networks of counterfeiters across London's underworld. Taverns, back rooms, black markets. He memorized faces, recorded testimonies, built airtight cases. Over 100 counterfeiters were prosecuted. Many were imprisoned. Several were executed. Newton showed no mercy. This shocks modern audiences, but it reveals something essential about him. Newton believed law was sacred. Whether it governed planets or people made no difference. Order preserved civilization. Disorder destroyed it. And disorder had no excuse. One counterfeiter, William Challoner, was particularly dangerous, clever, charismatic, and politically connected. Challoner attempted to manipulate Parliament, undermine the Mint, and discredit Newton himself. Newton responded with precision. He gathered witnesses, cross-checked alibis, exposed contradictions. Challoner was convicted and hanged in 1699. Newton attended the execution, not out of cruelty, out of closure. Under Newton's leadership, England's currency was reformed. The great recoinage stabilized the economy. Trust returned. The system worked. Once again, Newton had taken chaos and forced it into compliance. What is remarkable is how naturally he adapted. The same man who calculated planetary orbits now calculated human behavior. He understood incentives, predicted deception, anticipated resistance. Human systems, like natural ones, obeyed laws. You only had to identify them. In this role, Newton found something he had rarely known before: authority without challenge. At the Mint, his word was final. No rival scientists, no philosophical debates, no credit disputes, only execution of policy. And Newton excelled. In 1699, he was promoted to Master of the Royal Mint, a position he would hold until his death. This phase of his life reveals a final transformation. The solitary genius became an enforcer of order. The man who once feared exposure now wielded power openly. Newton had spent his youth discovering the laws of the universe. In his later years, he enforced them on Earth. The cosmos had been his first system. Civilization became his last. By the early 1700s, Isaac Newton no longer needed to prove anything. He had moved beyond discovery. He had entered dominance. In 1703, Newton was elected President of the Royal Society, the most powerful scientific institution in Britain. This was not a symbolic honor. It was control over the direction of science itself, who was heard, who was published, and who would be remembered. Newton ruled the Royal Society the way he believed the universe itself should be ruled. Firmly, precisely, without ambiguity. Debate, once central to scientific progress, became carefully managed. Newton did not encourage open confrontation. He encouraged alignment. Ideas that supported his framework flourished. Ideas that challenged it struggled to survive. This was not accidental. Newton believed that truth, once established, should not be endlessly questioned by lesser minds. To him, uncertainty was useful only until certainty was achieved. After that, doubt became disruption. As president, he reshaped science into a discipline of discipline. Mathematics was elevated above speculation, measurement above philosophy, proof above persuasion. The old style of natural philosophy, conversational, qualitative, rhetorical, was replaced by something colder and more exact. Modern science was being institutionalized. But Newton's rule was not gentle. He used his authority to settle old scores. Rivals found themselves excluded. Leibniz's supporters were marginalized in Britain. Alternative notations and methods were discouraged. Loyalty to Newton's approach mattered more than innovation. This had consequences. While Europe advanced rapidly in mathematics using Leibniz's calculus notation, Britain stagnated. Young British mathematicians were trained to defend Newton rather than surpass him. Progress slowed, yet the foundation held. Newton's reign ensured that science would never again drift into metaphysical speculation, unchecked by evidence. He imposed a standard that future generations could refine, even when they eventually corrected him. He was not building a democratic institution. He was building a fortress of certainty. And like all fortresses, it protected truth while limiting freedom. Newton did not see this as tyranny. He saw it as responsibility. Someone had to guard the laws. Someone had to decide when debate ended. And in his mind, no one was better suited than the man who had written the rules of the universe itself. Isaac Newton did not merely influence science. For a generation, he was science, and the world adjusted itself accordingly. There is a peculiar silence that exists only at the summit. Isaac Newton lived inside it. By the time he reached the height of his power, there were no equals left around him. He had outlived most rivals, outmaneuvered the rest, and risen into a position where disagreement no longer found its way to his ears. This was victory, and it was isolation. Newton was now Sir Isaac Newton knighted, revered, untouchable. His portrait hung in halls of authority. His name commanded instant respect. His opinions shaped institutions. But reverence creates distance. People no longer spoke freely around him. They deferred. They praised. They avoided contradiction. Conversation became cautious, filtered, empty of challenge. And without challenge, Newton withered. He had been forged in opposition. His greatest work emerged from resistance from doubt, rivalry, and inner conflict. Now, surrounded by agreement and fear, his mind had nothing left to fight. So it turned inward. Newton's days became rigidly structured. He followed routines with mechanical precision. Meals at fixed hours, walks at fixed times, conversations brief and functional. Order replaced curiosity. Control replaced wonder. He lived alone. No wife. No children. No intimate companions. His closest relationships were administrative clerks, assistants, subordinates. The man who unified the cosmos could not share a life. Visitors described him as distant but polite, powerful but emotionally inaccessible. He could be generous with praise when it cost him nothing but guarded when it threatened his authority. Loneliness did not make Newton soft. It made him static. He no longer sought new truths. He defended old ones. He watched over his legacy like a custodian guarding a sacred machine. Outside, the world changed. New thinkers rose. New questions formed. Subtle cracks appeared in Newtonian certainty, hints that space and time might not be as absolute as he believed. Newton did not pursue them. He had already built his universe, and he was content to live inside it. The tragedy is not that Newton was alone. It is that he chose it. Human complexity had always troubled him. People were unpredictable, emotional, irrational. The universe, at least, made sense. And so, at the top, crowned, respected, isolated Isaac Newton found himself surrounded by the order he had always wanted, and quietly deprived of the disorder that once made him great. Isaac Newton knew he was dying. By the mid-1720s, his body had begun to fail him. Digestion plagued him. Sleep came irregularly. The energy that once fueled nights of obsessive calculation was gone, replaced by long hours of reflection and silence. But his mind remained sharp, and more importantly, his legacy was secure. Newton did not fear death the way he had feared uncertainty. Death was inevitable, lawful, predictable. In many ways, it was the final system, one he did not need to control. He had already done what mattered. On the 20th of March 1727, Isaac Newton died in London at the age of 84. England did something unprecedented. They mourned a scientist like a king. Newton lay in state. Nobles carried his coffin. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, among monarchs and national heroes. No mathematician, no physicist, no thinker had ever been honoured this way before. It marked a shift in civilization. Power was no longer measured only by crowns or swords. It was measured by understanding. Newton's death did not end his rule. His laws continued to govern ships at sea, cannons in war, bridges under construction, and planets in the sky. Engineers trusted his equations more than intuition. Astronomers trusted them more than scripture. The universe behaved exactly as Newton had described. For generations, children learned his laws as facts of nature. Institutions were built around his framework. Reality itself seemed to endorse him every single day. Yet the man behind the laws faded quietly. No confessions, no final revelations, no dramatic regrets. Newton left behind mountains of unpublished work theology, alchemy, calculations, much of it never meant to be seen. Even in death, he remained partially hidden. This is fitting, because Isaac Newton was never interested in being understood, only in being correct. He did not live to comfort humanity. He lived to explain it, and in doing so, he achieved something almost no human ever has. He outlived himself. Long after his body was buried, his mind continued to rule nature, silent, precise, unavoidable. Death took the man. It could not touch the laws. For more than 2 centuries, Isaac Newton reigned unchallenged. His laws explained the fall of apples and the motion of planets with equal authority. Engineers trusted him. Astronomers depended on him. Civilization itself was built on his certainty. Then, in the early 20th century, a quiet disruption began. A young patent clerk named Albert Einstein noticed something strange. Newton's equations worked perfectly, but only when things moved slowly and gravity was weak. At extreme speeds, near the speed of light, the universe behaved differently. Time slowed, lengths contracted, mass increased. These effects were not errors in experiment. They were cracks in Newton's framework. Einstein did not attack Newton out of arrogance. He admired him deeply, but he followed the same principle Newton had taught the world. When observation contradicts assumption, assumption must fall. Einstein proposed something radical. Time was not absolute. Space was not fixed. Gravity was not a force. Gravity, Einstein argued, was the curvature of space-time itself, matter telling space how to bend, and space telling matter how to move. This overturned Newton's deepest assumptions. To many, it looked like defeat. It was not. Newton had never claimed final truth. He built the first complete model of reality, one that worked astonishingly well within its limits. Einstein simply revealed where those limits lay. Even today, spacecraft are launched using Newton's equations. Bridges are built with Newtonian mechanics. Machines run on Newton's laws. Einstein's relativity refines Newton. It does not replace him in everyday life. This is the ultimate measure of greatness. Newton was not wrong. He was incomplete. And that is the destiny of all foundational thinkers. Einstein himself acknowledged this. He famously said that if he had seen further, it was by standing on the shoulders of giants. Newton was the tallest of them all. The universe had grown more subtle, but it still bore Newton's fingerprints. Isaac Newton did more than discover laws. He changed the direction of the human mind. Before him, knowledge was inherited. Truth was argued from authority, tradition, or theology. Nature was interpreted through philosophy, symbolism, and belief. Newton replaced this with something unforgiving: evidence. He taught humanity that the universe does not care what we think. It obeys rules, whether we understand them or not. And if we wish to understand it, we must submit to those rules, not impose our desires upon them. This was a psychological revolution. After Newton, asking why was no longer enough. One had to ask how, and then prove it. He showed that complex reality could be reduced to simple principles. That motion, light, and gravity were not mysteries to be admired from afar, but systems to be measured, predicted, and mastered. From this mindset emerged everything modern: engineering, industry, space travel, technology. The world you live in runs on Newtonian thinking, even when it uses equations that go beyond his own. Newton also left a warning: genius demands cost. Precision demands sacrifice. The clarity he gave the universe came at the expense of warmth in his own life. He gained certainty and lost connection. He revealed order and lived in isolation. Yet history does not remember him for his loneliness. It remembers him for his method, to question relentlessly, to doubt tradition, to test everything, to accept results, even when they are uncomfortable. This is Newton's true legacy. Not apples, not equations, not monuments. A way of thinking that refuses illusion. The universe still obeys the laws he discovered, and humanity still thinks the way he taught it to think. That is immortality. Isaac Newton has been dead for nearly 3 centuries, and yet, every second of every day, the world still obeys him. When a plane lifts off a runway, it follows Newton. When a bridge carries thousands of tons without collapsing, it trusts Newton. When a rocket leaves Earth, it begins its journey using Newton's equations long before Einstein ever enters the calculation. This is not metaphor. This is literal. Newton is not a historical figure anymore, he is infrastructure. Modern civilization runs on assumptions Newton made in the 17th century. Engineers do not argue with his laws. They input them. Simulations rely on them. Machines depend on them. Without Newtonian mechanics, the physical world would become unpredictable, unsafe, and unusable. Despite everything discovered since relativity, quantum mechanics, modern cosmology, Newton is still the default. Why? Because for the scale of human life, Newton is terrifyingly accurate. Buildings do not bend space-time enough to require Einstein. Cars do not approach the speed of light. Bridges, cranes, elevators, factories all exist in a realm where Newton's universe works almost perfectly. When civil engineers calculate load distribution, they use Newton's laws. When mechanical engineers design engines, gears, and turbines, they use Newton. When architects test whether a structure will survive wind, earthquakes, or gravity itself, Newton decides. Even spaceflight begins with him. Before relativity corrects for extreme precision, rockets leave Earth using Newtonian trajectories. Orbital mechanics, escape velocity, momentum transfer, gravitational slingshots all come directly from Newton's framework. NASA still teaches Newton first. So do SpaceX engineers. So do military physicists. So do anyone who needs reality to behave reliably. This is the deepest proof of Newton's power. His laws are not admired. They are trusted. And trust is higher than praise. But there is something unsettling about this. Newton's universe does not care about intention. It does not care about morality. It does not care about hope. It cares only about force, mass, acceleration, and time. When an engineer miscalculates, a bridge collapses not because of fate, but because Newton was ignored. When a spacecraft fails, it is not tragedy, it is arithmetic. The universe does not forgive approximation. This is the Newtonian inheritance. Before Newton, nature could be blamed on gods, spirits, or chance. After Newton, failure became human responsibility. If something went wrong, it was not because the universe was mysterious, it was because someone misunderstood the laws. This shift changed psychology itself. Human beings moved from submission to accountability. The world was no longer something that happened to us. It was something that could be controlled. This is why modern civilization accelerates so fast. Because predictability creates power. Factories rely on repeatable motion. Transportation depends on calculable forces. Energy systems assume conservation laws. Entire economies are built on machines whose behavior must be reliable to the decimal. And all of it rests on Newton's worldview. Even when Einstein is used in GPS satellites, for example, Newton still handles most of the work. Relativity only adds corrections. Quantum mechanics only governs the very small. Newton governs the human scale. The world of hands, tools, machines, vehicles, and structures. The world you actually live in. This is why Newton has never been replaced. He has been contained. His laws are approximations, but they are approximations so good that abandoning them would cripple civilization. And this leads to a disturbing realization. Newton's universe is not philosophical anymore. It is operational. Children learn his laws before they learn ethics. Students are tested on them. Industries are built on them. Safety depends on them. Failure to understand them kills people. Newton is no longer debated. He is enforced. The irony is brutal. The man who lived isolated, suspicious, emotionally distant, created a universe that functions exactly the same way. Predictable, impersonal, unforgiving. In Newton's universe, there are no second chances, only recalculations. And yet, this is precisely why humanity advanced. Because comfort was replaced with certainty. We lost mystery. We gained control. Every moving object around you, from a swinging door to a passing train, is a silent confirmation that Newton was right enough to trust with reality itself. He does not need monuments. He does not need belief. The world already obeys him, and it will continue to do so every second long after his name fades from memory. Because laws, once written into reality, do not die. They only continue. For more than 2 centuries, Isaac Newton seemed untouchable. His laws worked. His predictions held. His universe behaved. To question Newton was not merely to challenge a man, it was to challenge reality itself. And that is precisely why his limits matter. Because no matter how vast a mind becomes, it still sees the universe from a human angle. Newton's genius was extraordinary, but it was not infinite. And the places where it failed reveal something more important than his successes. They reveal the danger of certainty. Newton believed in absolute time, a universal clock, ticking identically everywhere, unaffected by motion or gravity. It was elegant, necessary, and wrong. He believed in absolute space, a fixed, invisible stage on which the universe moved, stable, rational, and incomplete. These assumptions were not careless mistakes. They were structural necessities. Without them, Newton's system collapsed. His laws required a fixed background to make motion meaningful, so he declared it real, and for centuries, no one could disprove him. Then physics became precise enough to ask a forbidden question. What if time itself changes? Albert Einstein would eventually answer it. Time slowed with speed. Space bent with mass. Gravity was not a force, but geometry. Newton's absolutes shattered. Yet this was not a humiliation. It was a boundary. Newton had reached the edge of what could be known with the tools of his era, and that is what defines a limit. Another failure lay in light. Newton believed light was made of particles, corpuscles, tiny objects fired from luminous sources. This fit his mechanical worldview. Particles could be measured, controlled, predicted. Waves felt messy, and so Newton resisted them. Later experiments proved him wrong. Light behaved like a wave. Then later still, like both wave and particle. Newton had seen part of the truth, but not all of it. And then there was calculus. Newton invented it, but he imprisoned it. His refusal to publish early, his obsession with priority, and his authority as a scientific ruler froze British mathematics in time. While Europe advanced using Leibniz's clearer notation, Britain defended Newton's older system out of loyalty. Progress slowed. For decades, this was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of openness. Newton's confidence became a bottleneck. His certainty became a barrier. This is the paradox of godlike minds. When you are right too often, you begin to believe you are right by nature. Newton trusted his instincts sometimes more than evidence. He dismissed rivals, not because they were wrong, but because they were imperfect. Approximation offended him, but reality does not demand perfection. It demands correction. Newton struggled with this. He saw science as a fortress once built, to be defended. Later generations would see it as a process always provisional, always incomplete. This difference matters, because authority in science is dangerous. Newton's dominance delayed ideas that would have emerged sooner in a more open environment. His shadow was so large that it blocked light. Yet here is the truth that redeems him. Newton never claimed omniscience. Privately, he doubted constantly. He revised endlessly. He feared error. His public certainty masked private uncertainty. The limits of Newton's mind were not intellectual ceilings. They were human ones. He worked alone. He trusted few. He carried secrets. He fought rivals instead of collaborating. Modern science learned from this. It built systems where ideas matter more than names, where correction is valued over pride, where no single mind rules forever. These systems exist because Newton showed what happens when one does, and still his failures do not diminish him. They define him, because the greatest minds are not those who finish knowledge. They are those who push it to the breaking point. Newton did exactly that. He took human understanding as far as it could go, until reality itself forced a rewrite. And that is not weakness. That is greatness with limits. The most honest legacy a genius can leave behind. He frightens us because he was right enough to remove comfort from the universe. Before Newton, reality was personal. The cosmos had intention. Events could be explained through will, purpose, divine choice, or fate. When something went wrong, humans could blame gods, spirits, or destiny itself. Newton took that away. In his universe, nothing happens because it means something. Things happen because forces act. This is deeply unsettling even now. Newton's world is not cruel, but it is indifferent. Objects fall not because they are meant to, but because mass attracts mass. Planets move not because they are guided, but because equations demand it. There is no preference, no mercy, no intention written into motion. Only law. And law does not negotiate. This is why Newton still terrifies us. Because his universe does not care who you are. In a Newtonian world, virtue does not bend gravity. Hope does not change acceleration. Belief does not alter trajectories. The universe behaves the same whether you are good or evil, faithful or skeptical, desperate or confident. This was a psychological shock humanity never fully recovered from. Newton did not merely explain how things move. He implied that nothing moves for your sake. Determinism entered human thought through his equations. If forces determine motion, and motion determines outcomes, then where does freedom live? If the future can be calculated from the present, is choice an illusion? Newton did not answer these questions. He made them unavoidable. This is why philosophers struggled after him. Free will felt smaller, responsibility felt heavier, meaning felt harder to justify. The universe no longer whispered purpose. It enforced consequence. For many, this felt cold. For others, liberating. But for no one, neutral. Even today, we resist Newton emotionally. We accept his laws in engineering but hesitate to apply them to ourselves. We still want exceptions, miracles, meaning, narrative. We want the universe to notice us. Newton's universe does not, and that silence is terrifying. What makes this fear deeper is that Newton's framework works. It delivers results. It predicts reality. It builds machines that never ask questions and never make mistakes unless we do. We trust Newton with our lives. Planes fly because of him. Hospitals function because of him. Cities stand because of him. Yet emotionally, we recoil from his world view because it implies something uncomfortable. That safety comes from understanding, not belief. That failure is not punishment, it is miscalculation. That the universe will not save us from ourselves. This creates a strange contradiction. We depend on Newton's universe, but we do not want to live inside it psychologically. We soften it with stories. We overlay it with meaning. We carve out spaces where law gives way to hope. And this is why Newton feels harsher than later scientists. Einstein bends space and time poetic, elegant, almost mystical. Quantum mechanics introduces uncertainty, a kind of cosmic humility. Chaos theory restores unpredictability. Newton allows none of this. His universe is rigid, clean, unforgiving. It demands responsibility without consolation. And that frightens us more than chaos ever could, because chaos lets us blame chance. Newton makes us accountable. Even Newton himself struggled with this implication. He believed deeply in God, not because his science required it, but because he needed something beyond law, something that explained why laws existed at all. But he never placed that comfort inside the equations. He kept God outside the system. The laws still ran on their own. That separation haunts modern thought. We live in a world where meaning is optional, but consequence is not, where intention does not override physics, where the universe does not adjust itself to human feelings. This is Newton's true legacy. Not equation, not apples, but the emotional weight of a lawful cosmos. He forced humanity to grow up, to stop pleading with nature, to stop negotiating with reality, to learn, calculate, adapt, or fail. And that is terrifying, because it means the universe will not meet us halfway. We must meet it fully, or be crushed by indifference. Newton did not just explain the world, he removed its excuses. And that is why, centuries later, his shadow still feels cold. There are very few moments in history when humanity does not merely learn something new, but becomes something different. Isaac Newton created one of those moments. Before Newton, truth belonged to authority. Kings ruled by divine right. Knowledge flowed downward from tradition, scripture, and philosophy. Nature was interpreted, not interrogated. To question too deeply was dangerous. Newton reversed the direction. After him, truth had to justify itself. Nature was no longer something to be explained with stories. It was something to be measured, tested, and obeyed. Reality stopped asking for belief and started demanding evidence. This change did not happen overnight, but once it began, it never stopped. Newton's greatest contribution was not gravity or motion. It was a method, a way of thinking that taught humanity how to approach the unknown. Observe, measure, question, calculate, accept results even when they are uncomfortable. This mindset spread beyond science. Economics adopted it. Markets became systems to analyze rather than fortunes to interpret. Engineering absorbed it. Structures were designed mathematically, not artistically alone. Medicine inherited it. The body became a system governed by mechanisms rather than mysteries. Even politics felt its influence. Power slowly shifted from bloodlines to competence. Institutions began to value expertise. Systems were evaluated for efficiency rather than tradition. Newton did not invent modern society, but he gave it permission to exist. The Industrial Revolution was impossible without Newtonian mechanics. Machines require predictability. Factories require repeatability. Transportation requires reliable motion. Energy systems require conservation laws. All of this rests on Newton's worldview. So does capitalism. So does technology. So does globalization. The modern world is fast because it is predictable. And it is predictable because Newton made it so. But every gain has a cost. In replacing mystery with mechanism, humanity lost something intangible. Wonder became optional. Meaning became personal rather than universal. The universe stopped caring about our narratives. Progress accelerated. Comfort declined. We gained power and inherited responsibility. In Newton's world, failure is not fate. It is ignorance. This is a heavy burden for a species that evolved telling stories, not solving equations. And yet, we adapted. We learned to trust calculation more than instinct. We began building futures instead of awaiting them. This is why Newton matters more than any single invention. He did not give us answers. He gave us a discipline, and that discipline reshaped our psychology. We no longer ask what the universe intends. We ask what it allows. We do not pray for outcomes. We engineer them. This shift is irreversible. Even when we rebel against science emotionally, we depend on it structurally. Even when we seek meaning elsewhere, we rely on Newton's laws to survive. This is Newton's final irony. He was a deeply religious man who created a world where belief is optional. He was emotionally isolated, yet he connected humanity to reality more intimately than anyone before him. He sought certainty and gave humanity uncertainty about its place in the cosmos, but also power, and power changes everything. Today, humanity stands on the edge of new revolutions: artificial intelligence, space colonization, genetic engineering. Each of these inherits Newton's method. Measure first, believe later. If Isaac Newton were alive today, he might not recognize our technology, but he would recognize our thinking. That is immortality of the highest order, not being remembered, but being repeated. Every time we demand proof, every time we test instead of assume, every time we accept reality instead of wishing it were different, we are choosing Newton. And through that choice, we become what he made possible. A species that no longer waits for the universe to explain itself. A species that explains the universe and then decides what to do with the knowledge. That is what humanity became after Newton. And there is no going back. There is a moment that comes after every great revelation. A moment no one talks about. It is not celebration. It is not applause. It is silence. Isaac Newton brought humanity to that silence. After the laws were written, after the universe was reduced to motion, force, mass, and time, something strange happened. The questions stopped being cosmic and became personal. The mystery did not disappear, it relocated. Before Newton, humans looked at the sky and asked, "What does it want from us?" After Newton, they looked inward and asked, "What do we want from ourselves?" This was the quiet aftermath of understanding. Newton did not destroy mystery. He compressed it. He took the vast, terrifying unknown and pushed it into smaller, sharper spaces. Consciousness, choice, meaning, morality. The universe became legible, but the human role inside it became harder to define. And that silence still surrounds us. We live in a world where almost nothing surprises nature anymore. We predict storms, track planets, simulate universes inside machines. We calculate futures with frightening accuracy. The cosmos no longer speaks in riddles. It speaks in data, yet meaning does not emerge from equations. And that is the unresolved tension Newton left behind. When the universe stops explaining itself in stories, humans must do the explaining. When reality becomes mechanical, values must become intentional. Purpose is no longer inherited, it is constructed. Newton did not answer the question, "Why are we here?" He made it unavoidable. This is why his legacy feels heavier than other geniuses. He did not offer comfort, he offered clarity, and clarity removes excuses. In a Newtonian world, ignorance is not innocence, it is risk. Responsibility replaces fate. Agency replaces prayer. Progress replaces patience. This is exhausting, and yet it is empowering, because silence is not emptiness. Silence is space. The silence Newton left behind is the space where humanity learned to decide. Decide how to use power. Decide what progress means. Decide what should be built and what should not. Newton gave us the ability to shape reality, but not the wisdom to choose outcomes. That burden belongs entirely to us. And perhaps that is why Newton himself lived, as he did, withdrawn, disciplined, severe. He understood something deeply uncomfortable, that understanding the universe does not tell you how to live in it. That part is harder. Today, we stand in the long echo of Newton's silence. Technology accelerates faster than philosophy. Knowledge grows faster than wisdom. The laws are clear, but the direction is not. This is not a failure of science. It is its consequence. Newton taught us how to know. He did not teach us how to be, and maybe that was never his task. His task was to strip the universe of illusion so that whatever meaning we choose to build would be honest. No gods hiding in gaps. No miracles covering ignorance. No stories excusing failure. Only reality. And choice. In that sense, Newton did not end mystery. He relocated it to the only place it truly belongs, the human mind. The silence after understanding is not cold. It is demanding. It asks, "Now that you know how the universe works, what will you do with that knowledge?" Newton never answered. He left the question open, and 3 centuries later, we are still standing inside it. That is his final contribution. Not laws, not equations, but the silence that forces humanity to decide who it wants to become.